In this follow-up lecture to the third session on argumentation and argument structure, I'd like to explore the notion of choice a little bit more. And I'd like to tackle it from the point of view of bias. So, as we face choice situations, are we going to be biased in how we make those choices? And if yes, is that a good thing or a bad thing? We usually think of bias as an undesirable thing, but I'm going to argue in this follow-up lecture that biases in terms of making choices are, first of all, unavoidable. We can't do research without making choices. And if these choice situations create bias in our thinking, how do we make sure that as we're having a conversation around the table with our peers, we understand what one another's biases are, that we can make them explicit? So I tried to build a bridge toward a positive understanding of bias instead of thinking of it as something undesirable and something to be avoided. Here is the material I am going to build on in this follow-up lecture. Mostly stuff you've already seen. So I'm going to be revisiting the notion of confirmation bias. I will discuss the examples of economic inequality and the organizational economics example, the Schwinn example. So this is largely the same. And then I'll bring in a couple ideas from Herbert Simon's work. The Nickerson article on confirmation bias does little more than state the obvious when Nickerson writes that it's very easy to make the case that confirmation bias is a bad thing. And you can see all the adverse, undesirable consequences that bias can have. But there is a really important section in Nickerson where he looks at the potential utility of confirmation bias and the utility of confirmation bias in scientific research in particular. I strongly recommend that you take another look at Nickerson, and especially the part where he talks about the utility of confirmation bias. Let me try to propose a maximally neutral definition of bias. You know, as a statistician, when I think of bias, it really has a negative ring to it. We would like to avoid biased estimators and biased estimates. And in the notion of confirmation bias, it's easy to make the case that confirmation bias is bad. But let me offer this as a maximally neutral definition. Bias is a particular preconceived inclination. And we all have particular preconceived inclinations based on our histories, based on our training, based on our knowledge of different contexts, certain contexts as opposed to others. So these preconceived inclinations are built into us. We're almost hardwired to perceive what we observe through preconceptions. Instead of prescribing that we should try to eliminate those preconceptions, it's almost like trying to prescribe that the remedy to bounded rationality is to become more rational. Well, I don't think that's an actionable prescription. Let me go through the two examples that I discussed in session number 3. Let me start with the Schwinn case. Again, this is a case that Supplemental and I documented in our 21 piece. But let me just make the points about bias by using the antitrust argument and the efficiency argument. In what ways are these arguments biased? Well, both views start at the same grounds, the same facts. So comparing these two to one another, there's really no bias in what they acknowledge as factual premises. The bias, if any, is found in the way this evidence is interpreted. Of course, if we think of criminal activities, there is this bias in the sense that people's behaviors are more salient and ascertainable than their motivations and intentions. But we know that for there to be a ruling of guilty, what the prosecution has to establish is criminal intent, criminal motivation. So just observing a certain behavior is not going to be sufficient. So in this sense, there is some inherent bias, if you will, already in the grounds, in that the grounds are more likely to involve behaviors than motivations and intentions. See how the motivations and intentions are really embedded in the claim. Schwinn used coercion to create a monopoly position. So this is ascribing intent. Or in the efficiency argument, Schwinn sought to improve efficiency of transaction. Again, it is ascribing intent and motivation to what we observe in the grounds. And this is where the bias comes in, or the preconceived inclination. The preconceived inclination to see vertical restraints as attempts at creating monopoly positions versus improving efficiency, those preconceived inclinations, I submit, are found in the warrants. The antitrust people viewed Schwinn's behaviors through the lens of the firm as a production function and through the lens of the premise that there are certain things that are simply illegal per se, vertical rate restraints being one of those things. The efficiency people viewed the firm not as a production function but as a governance structure, and adopted the way of looking at vertical restraints as coordination. So these are bias under the definition of being particular preconceived inclinations, but are they bad things? Are the antitrust and efficiency people adopting these ways of seeing because they really want to find Schwinn guilty or not guilty? Well, this is where the bad kind of bias starts to creep in. Suppose that the judiciary decided, oh, we have to find Schwinn guilty, which is certainly bias in the bad sense, because in most countries, in most legal systems, legal proceedings start at the presumption of innocence. So if there's a presumption of guilt, then that's a bad thing. But the presumption of viewing the firm in a certain way, or acknowledging that certain actions are illegal per se, that's not the bad kind of bias. And in fact, those warrants built on theories of industrial organization and legal interpretation, history, and precedent. So this notion of per se illegality of certain actions, it's not biased. It is based on precedent and history in legal interpretation. I would say, based on this example, that I would be concerned with the kind of bias that readily endorses a certain claim. And I would also label the bad kind of bias the kind of argumentation that doesn't consider alternative interpretations and explanations. And this was the objective of the efficiency argument, not to say that the antitrust argument is wrong, that it cannot possibly be the case that Schwinn used coercion. No, the rebuttal is aimed at the very strong unconditional qualifier, evidently. So the efficiency argument was that the Supreme Court really should entertain other plausible, feasible explanations and interpretations. And if it does, if it finds another plausible interpretation, then we have just introduced reasonable doubt. And in criminal cases, reasonable doubt should be sufficient to find the defendant not guilty. So, I think that the Schwinn example nicely exemplifies and illustrates the good kind of bias and the bad kind of bias. We all need warrants in our arguments. So in that sense, the bias is unavoidable. We have access to certain grounds and not others, and that again creates unavoidable bias. Something we have to live with. But something we don't have to live with is to decide in advance what kind of a claim we are going to endorse. And ultimately, for our conversations to advance and to progress, we need different participants around the table making different kinds of claims, adopting different kinds of warrants, and seeing where they lead us in terms of the claims. So ultimately, every argument, even scholarly argument, is going to take a side. Or let me put that differently. It's not the scholar that takes a side. It's the argument that is put on one side of the debate. And skilled scholars can put arguments on both sides of the debate. And this is where I'm reminded of Herbert Simon, who wrote that if you see a certain paradigm dominating your thinking, how about you join the opposition and fight your predisposition for a while? I find great wisdom in this idea. So it's not the scholar that is asked to take a side. Again, nobody cares on what side of the argument you are or the debate you are. What people around the table want to hear are explicit, transparent, rigorous arguments that make a point. And if you're able to put arguments on multiple sides of the debate, I think you may impress your audience. Let me also revisit the economic inequality debate, and let me comment on the biases that we need to understand. First of all, I think these biases, these preconceived ways of looking at the grounds are inevitable. So the best we can do is make them transparent. So if there is a choice situation, make the choice transparent. Let me pinpoint a couple choice situations where I think that those who are having the conversation with Piketty would benefit from added transparency. Let me start at the backings. If we are going to view economic inequality as something that is subject to general laws, such as R being greater than G, constituting a fundamental inequality, where does this choice come from? There are many other ways of viewing economic inequality, but to take a very simple mathematical inequality that looks at only two factors, we'd like to understand where that comes from. The second one is the Rawls's difference principle. Why do we pick the difference principle instead of the average utility principle? Both can be found in Rawls's theory of justice. And then I talked about this at the lecture. There are several ways of looking at executive compensation, Piketty chose managerial hegemony. Again, we would benefit from understanding why hegemony over institutional theory or agency theory. And I'm not saying that these create the bad kind of bias, but they do create a bias in the sense that they create a lens through which the grounds are going to be viewed. And as I argued in the lecture, the warrants that Piketty uses, they strongly condition the way he looks at, for instance, the empirical inference that R persistently exceeds G. And also, as I pointed out in the lecture, two of the key rebuttals were aimed at two of the warrants. So I think that there's a very positive function of the Toulmin model here. It exposes the biases, the preconceived ways of looking at the grounds. So I think that we can now have a more elaborate, more informed understanding of how the arguments about economic inequality are biased in ways that are unavoidable. In terms of the grounds, so what is the bias in the grounds? Well, since these are based on tax records, estate records, there is a bias toward being able to look at income in more detail than wealth. And again, is that inevitable, unavoidable? It probably is. Like I mentioned in the lecture, the data that at least I would really like to look at, for me, the ideal data set on economic inequality is one where I have full data on household wealth and income traced over time at the level of the individual household. I think that's where the action is. So instead of looking at categories, the top 1%, the bottom 10%, and so on, categories that are surprisingly fluid over time. People move in and out of these categories. There are some who will stay in the specific category, but there's a lot of dynamics in these categories. And that's why instead of looking at categories, we would really like to look at flesh and blood people or households and how household income and wealth develops over time. Well, since we often don't have access to these kind of data, that does create biases in the grounds, unavoidable biases, but we need to understand what the consequences are for not being able to look at the kind of data that we would really like to look at. And we can always get better. We can always try to get better data. So in this sense, this kind of bias can be overcome or can be alleviated, at least to an extent. The only place where I am really concerned with bias and predisposition is if we pick the claims that we want to make based on our predispositions and then start retrofitting grounds and warrants to make that claim look credible. So if we are only seeking the kinds of grounds that help us make the claim that we want to make, we can maybe see it in practical debates, political debates, where a representative of a specific position essentially starts with the claim and then starts retrofitting grounds and warrants, starts cherry picking the premises that support that conclusion. And we have at least some evidence that human beings individually and collectively are very skilled at doing this. We're very skilled at making our claims look as if they were the conclusions of a deductive chain of arguments. But if we're retrofitting grounds and warrants to fit our claim, then at best that is abductive reasoning. and at worst, just simply opportunism. In summary, bias is unavoidable. It's not altogether a bad thing. It can be a bad thing. I think that the Toulmin model can help us have a conversation about the kinds of unavoidable and avoidable biases that we have in our scholarly conversations. It helps us make these biases and predispositions transparent and explicit. It helps us understand where these biases should be mitigated and alleviated. And it may even help us think of ways by which this can be done. So, in summary, I want you to rethink or think more broadly about the notion of bias. That it's not just a bad thing. It's not just about, hey, we're going to see what we want to see. I would reframe that and say we often see what we are preconceived to see. So let's try to understand the preconceptions better. That helps me understand my own reasoning and argumentation better. And that means that I can make my reasoning and argumentation more transparent to the rest of the table. And I will also be able to understand better the argumentation and the predisposition of others. So even if my backings and warrants are ultimately incommensurate with the backings and the warrants of someone else, we can still have a conversation. So the antitrust and the efficiency people could still have a conversation about how should we view the application of vertical restraints. We don't have to agree or find common ground to have a productive conversation. Even if we strongly disagree, as long as the disagreement is explicit and transparent, that takes the conversation forward. That's the key message of this follow-up lecture.